Afternoon, everybody. Adam Crowdhammer, president of Local 802 here in New York. Also founding member and executive director of Musicians for Pension Security. We'll go ahead and give everybody about another 30 seconds, but we're really excited for our guest today. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce Norm shortly. But in the meantime, I just want to thank everybody for taking the time out of their day. I know everybody's very busy. You know, everybody's also trying to hang in through what is an incredibly tough time for professional musicians across the country right now. We had about almost 500 RSVPs, so it's a large group. No surprise, this is a really important issue. Just a couple in outline for today. After I introduce Norman, he's gonna take us through the MEPRA process, and this is he's just gonna discuss basically the process itself, the timing, but not specifically our application itself just yet. And then after that, he's going to discuss everything everybody wants to know about legislation in DC, possibilities, what's viable, what's going on behind the scenes, what applies to the AFM. And after that, we have, since it's such a large group, we'd ask people to submit questions. We have a lot of questions that we're going to try and go over. You know, Norm's going to take all of the questions related to legislation and policy and process. The others I'll try and help out with and moderate. We hope to open her up for questions for 10 or 15 minutes at the end. We'll do that. Everybody will have to click on the bottom. And if you click on reactions, there is a raised hand icon. So when we do that, I'm simply just going to open her up. And if you raise your hand, I will call on you, unmute, and you could ask your question. It's the best way we could come up with a few hundred people on a Zoom to try and get in-person questions in. Norm has been gracious enough to say that anybody who has questions that we don't get to today, and I will say this again at the end, please email us at Local 802 where you've been emailing your questions, and we will get back to everybody with whatever their specific question is, as long as we can answer it. All right, so that being said, allow me to introduce Professor Norman Stein. Norm is a nationally recognized authority on pension law, employee benefits, and tax law. He's produced a rich body of scholarship, and he's actively involved in policy development and frequently testifies before Congress. I believe Norm is currently a professor at Drexel University. Before that, he was the Douglas Arendt Professor of Law at the University of Alabama. He's been a visiting professor at University of Texas, Indiana University, University of California, Davis. He served as counsel to the American Association of Retired Persons and as a consultant to the General Accounting Office, and testified before the US Congress on pension issues. He's also the former chair of the Employee Benefits section of the Association of American Law Schools. That is just part of Norman's extensive bio. I've known Norman for many years. I know Norman through the Pension Rights Center, and as somebody that reached out to me asking how he could help, I've known him for many years, and never once has he not picked up the phone when I've called or offered to help professional musicians across the country try and figure out what is a very, very complex issue for us. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Norm, And he's, as I said, for those of you just signing on, he's going to take us through a bit of the process related to a MEPRA application being filed. And then he's going to go into a discussion of legislation. After that, we'll do the pre-submitted questions. And after that, we will try and take some live questions. And anything that doesn't get answered, you send to me, and I assure you we will do our best to answer whatever we can. So Norm, floor is yours.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about a number of things. And as Adam said, part of what I'm going to talk about and what he asked me to talk about first was the so-called MEPRA process and application, and then turn to legislation. But before I start talking about MEPRA and the application process, I do want to go briefly out of order and just mention that the Democratic senators and representatives are trying to use something called the budget reconciliation process to get legislation enacted in this area. And I'm going to talk more about that process, but I do want to say, those of you who have followed pensions know there's talk about red zones and yellow zones. But in football, a red zone means, being in the red zone means something good, right? You're beyond the 20-yard line. And this is, at this point, I think, the first time since MEPRA has been passed that we've been in the red zone in terms of getting legislation enacted. And I think there's a, there's a really good reason to be optimistic that there will be legislation that will save the plan enacted by mid-March. Now, that's not a sure thing, of course, but it's, I think, reason to be really optimistic. And when I talk about legislation, we'll come back to that. So the reason I wanted to say this initially is I'm hoping that the MEPRA application becomes irrelevant. And one of the things that I think is, at least I'd like to see is that the application be temporarily withdrawn while this legislative process plays out. Okay, so what I want to do very briefly first is talk about what the law looked like before MEPRA. Right, before MEPRA, you have multi-employer pension plans, and the way the law dealt with financial problems that these plans might have is the plan continues to pay benefits basically until it runs out of money. All right, so that was a scheme that was in place before MEPRA, and it's still in place even after MEPRA for plans that don't use the MEPRA process. All right, so basically plans pay benefits until they can't, and when they can pay benefits, the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, right, which I'm sure most of you know what that is now, but it's a federal insurance agency for backstopping benefits in multi-employer plans. The Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation makes sure the plans can pay benefits up to a guaranteed level. And the guaranteed level is really quite low, particularly for plans like the AFM plan, which has reasonably decent benefits. And the guarantee is based on how many, in large part, how many years of service credit you have with the plan. For an employee that or for a musician in this case who has 30 years of participation in the plan, the maximum guarantee is $12,870. All right, so that's pretty low. So that's the way things worked before MEPRA for all plans. And for a variety of reasons, multi-employer pension plans began experiencing a lot of difficulty at the turn of the century, right? And the reasons people often point to is we had two big market crashes, the dot-com bubble and then the housing bubble, but there were other factors at play as well, all right? So some of them were industry specific. I think you know far better than me what's happened to the music industry and that there are probably fewer younger people coming into the plan. The plan's population thus is aging. And there were some other difficulties also. Interest rates were very low, and participants just were getting older. So plans that were accumulating assets now had to pay more assets out. Right. So those problems afflicted all multi-employer plans, and some multi-employer plans handle that very well, some not as well. In 2010, approximately, there was a move to try and get relief into underfunded multi-employer pension plans in the Senate. Senator Casey from Pennsylvania pushed a bill that would have basically taken employees from bankrupt companies who participated in these plans and pushed their liabilities over to the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, right? Relieving the plans of responsibility for those employees or those participants whose employers were no longer participating in the plan, often because of bankruptcy. That legislation didn't get very far. It didn't get very far because—
Hi, how are you?
Yeah, I guess people should—
Yeah, and I called Mr. Adams, like, I don't know, maybe about an hour ago, and he took me
not
through
sure where
to
that's coming from,
IT,
Norm. Hang
but
on.
they never called me back. So yeah, I forgot. Basically, so Hide and 4J. Hide. Thank you.
Whoever
Okay,
is,
well, I was just muted. So anyway, that legislation, to get far, it was characterized primarily by Republicans as a bailout for union pension plans, and a trade group which had been pushing for this legislation to get money into the plans took a different approach, and the different approach became MEPRA. And they said, okay, if you won't give us money, let the plans cut benefits, which up to now they really haven't been able to do. And that report, or the recommendation to take that approach, was released in 2013 by this trade association, the National Coordinating Committee on Multi-Employer Plans. And in late 2014, Congress, in December, late December actually, Congress adopted this proposal, and that became MEPRA. Now, what MEPRA allows an underfunded pension plan to do, if it's severely enough underfunded, and we'll talk about what that means in a second, is apply to the Department of Treasury to actually cut benefits, something that it couldn't do without Treasury permission. The application process itself requires that the plan give notice to participants, presumably in, well, the statute says in language that is designed for the average participant to be able to understand. And once the application is submitted, the Department of Treasury has 225 days to rule on it. And if it doesn't rule within 225 days, the application is considered approved. Of course, that's never happened. Treasury has always ruled on the application within that 225 days. There's a 45-day comment period, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with from the first application that the AFM Pension Fund submitted. So we're again into that comment period, and I believe the comment period ends March 7th. And one thing that you might keep in mind is the comment period ends before the legislation that I'm going to talk about in the second part of my discussion will be finally passed. All right, so the comment period ends before we'll know for certain whether there's legislation, which does mean you need to take this MEPRA application very seriously. Okay, so what does the application process require of the plan? And the statute says in order for Treasury, the Department of Treasury, to approve an application, the plan has to show certain things or has to do certain things. And the first thing it has to show is that it's going to run out of money, basically, become insolvent, which has a technical meaning under the statute. The technical meaning is it doesn't have any more money, that it will become insolvent within, depending on the characteristics of the plan, either within 15 years or 20 years, right? So the first thing the plan has to do is it says, if we can't cut benefits, we're going to run out of money within either 15 or 20 years, right? And that's called critical and declining status, just if you want a title for it. The second thing that the plan has to show is that the plan is projected to avoid insolvency if the proposed benefit cuts are accepted, right? So one, you say, I'm going to run out of money if I don't make the benefit cuts. Two, we won't run out of money, or we probably won't run out of money. We're projected not to run out of money if we make the benefit cuts. The third thing the plan has to show is that the benefit cuts are just right? It's kind of like the three bears, it can't be too much, it can't be too little, it has to be just right, that the benefit cuts can't have the effect of giving the plan more of a cushion than it needs, right? So that's really the third requirement. The fourth requirement is that the benefit cuts have to be distributed equitably among the population of participants and beneficiaries, right? And that's actually, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, but the trustees have a lot of discretion in how they shape the benefit cuts. And the fifth thing, which I think is kind of related to the fourth, is there are limits on the benefit cuts. And there are basically three limits. The first limit says that the benefit cut can be no deeper than 110% of the guarantee that PBGC would pay if the plan actually did become insolvent. All right, so if you're a 30-year employee, that would be $12,870 plus another $1,200 something, right? So that's the first limit. The second limit is that if you have a disability benefit under the plan, your benefit cannot be cut, right? That's just solicitude for people who are disabled on the theory that they have special concerns that should shield them from benefit cuts. And the third limitation has to do with age. If you're over 80, you're immunized against any benefit cuts. And if you're between 75 and 80, you're partially immunized. That is, you would determine the cut that's applicable to you and only a portion of that cut, 20% for 75-year-olds, 40% or 80%, I guess, for 75-year-olds, 60% for 76-year-olds would actually reduce your benefit. The other thing that has to be shown by the plan is that the plan took all reasonable measures to avoid insolvency. Right, pretty vague criteria, but that's something the plan has to show, that it's taken all, and the really important word here is the adjective reasonable. The plan has taken all reasonable measures to avoid insolvency. For large plans, and your plan is a large plan for this purpose, the plan also the trustees have to appoint a retiree representative, somebody who will represent the interests of people who are already retired and people who are no longer participating in the plan, but haven't yet begun receiving retirement benefits, right? So sometimes they're referred to as deferred vested participants, right? They're no longer working, accumulating new credit, but they're not yet retired. And the final thing that happens, if Treasury goes ahead and says the application is satisfactory, then there's a vote. And if the participants in the plan vote not to have benefit cuts, then the benefit cuts don't go into effect, except if the plan is something called systemically important to the PBGC. And that's a kind of complicated definition. I don't believe the AFM plan, even though it's significant to, to everybody on this call, I don't believe the AFM plan would be considered significant in this, to this extent, right? The basic requirement is that if it terminates, the PBGC will have to pay more than $1 billion. Right? I don't think that's the case here, but I'm not absolutely certain about that. It would take an actuary to figure that out. The problem with the vote is, as we'll talk a little bit about in a moment, people who don't vote are considered votes of support for the application. Right? So if you don't vote, you're voting yes. And because of the special rules that don't allow cuts for people over 80 and people who are disabled, and reduce cuts for people between 75 and 79, plus the fact that in most MEPR applications, younger people are really not cut at all, or very little. There's usually only about 50 or so % of people who are actually going to experience benefit cuts of any significant size, right? So you start off with half the population, probably not particularly interested in this because it doesn't affect them, or it doesn't affect them very much. And if those people don't vote, the application will pass, right? So the vote is really sort of illusory. It's there, but it's almost impossible to have an application turned down because of the vote. There have been some legislative efforts to change that, but they haven't been successful. Okay, so when you're looking at an application, right, you have this right to file a comment. And I think last time the comments were, I think, very effective in influencing the Department of Treasury. So you have until March 7th to write comments. Your comments, it's good to talk in your comments about how this personally affects you. But the things that are legally significant are the things that the plan has to prove in its application in order for Treasury to approve the application. Right, so the first thing the plan has to show is that it's in critical and declining status, and there's no question that this plan is in critical and declining status. Right. The second thing that the plan has to show is that if we make the benefit cuts, we probably are going to be okay. We'll probably avoid insolvency. Right. Most of that is very technical. It depends on the assumptions that the plan's actuaries are using to demonstrate that the plan will avoid insolvency. And in fact, the first application submitted by the AFM pension fund was turned down because the actuaries did two things that Treasury said were unreasonable. One is it used a standard basically population-based mortality table without showing that musicians, or without showing that this was appropriate for musicians, right? Because participants in this plan are musicians. They may not have the same mortality, they'll be subject to the same mortality risks that the general population is subject to, right? If you're a policeman or a sanitation worker, your life expectancy is probably a lot shorter than if you're a musician. So that was one thing they said. You didn't show that this was an appropriate mortality table for this population. The second thing that they said was, you're assuming a lot of new people are going to come into the plan. And we think that assumption is wrong, particularly with respect to the age at which you think new people are going to come into the plan. That wasn't justified. And without those assumptions, the plan would not be able to remain or to avoid insolvency. Now, the thing about commenting on this is really very technical, right? And this is stuff that Treasury's actuaries are going to look at. But if you're reading the application and you notice that the plan is assuming things that you think are untrue, right, that's something that could go into the comment, into a comment, and would be considered by Department of Treasury with respect to this criteria. Equitable distribution, right? If you're unhappy with the cut that's been assigned to you and you think it's unfair, that's what this is talking about. The problem is that the statute gives the trustees really broad discretion, right, in deciding how to equitably distribute cuts. All reasonable measures. I know that there are a lot of things that a number of people think that this plan could have done and still can do and should have done. Those are the kinds of things that would address this application criteria, right? The plan hasn't taken all reasonable steps to avoid insolvency. And in fact, Musicians for Pension Security hired an actuary who came up with kind of an other plan, right? The other thing that may be relevant here is that we have legislation that's on the horizon, and that's certainly a reasonable measure that the plan might take to avoid insolvency. Retiree representative, if you're not happy with the way the retiree representative is representing your interests, if you're retired or deferred vested participant, that would be something that would be appropriate, I think, in the application. Okay, you might also talk about notice. If you think that the notice hasn't been clear and you're struggling to figure out how this will affect you and how the plan did what it did, that might be something else to comment about. Right, so when you're writing comments, personal stories plus addressing these statutory criteria are sort of what you want to be thinking about. Okay, so let me go through now very quickly kind of what's been happening legislatively. All right, almost from the beginning of MEPRA in 2015, a number of senators and congressmen began saying this wasn't a good approach to solving the problem of underfunded multi-employer plans. And Bernie Sanders in 2015 introduced a bill that would have basically given money to pension plans, multi-employer plans that had a lot of these orphan employees, right? People who were still participants in the plan, but their employers were no longer contributing. Yeah, so that was kind of the first legislation. And then we later, there was legislation which went under the name of the Butch-Lewis Act, which is named after a Teamster who was very active in opposing MEPRA, who died during, after 2014. And the first Butch-Lewis Act would have made very large loans to plans, right? And the idea was the plans would get time to get their houses in financial order, and the loans would be large enough and the plans wouldn't have to pay very much interest, so they could invest and get a higher return than the interest rates they had to pay back to the Department of Treasury, right? This was supported by Democrats. It actually passed the House of Representatives at one point, but it was really opposed to by many Republicans who regarded it as giving money to union pension plans who got themselves into trouble. More recently, was a Republican bill that was largely drafted by Senators Grassley and Alexander. Of course, Alexander is no longer in the Senate, he's retired. And it used something called a partition device. And the partition device simply meant that the PBGC would take over some of the plan's liabilities, not all of them. All right, so since the PBGC now is paying some of the plan's benefits, the plan didn't have to pay so much itself, and it would, its money would be adequate to continue paying the non-partition benefits, the benefits that were not transferred to the PBGC. And this also became a model, a template for a lot of Democratic proposals, right? To get on the same page as the Republicans. And the major differences between the two bills, and I'm going to come to this in just a couple of minutes when I focus on what's happened in January and February. The major differences between the Grassley-Alexander bill and the Democratic side partition bills was how much money the federal government would pay and how much would come from other sources, primarily direct benefit cuts to retirees and indirect benefit cuts to, or in some cases, direct benefit cuts coming to active workers. Right, so, and there were also, and I'll talk about this too in a moment, there were also differences in what the rules should be going forward. Right, the Republican bill had more governance reform, changing the way these plans operate, and also would have changed the funding rules, requiring employers to put more money into the plans for any given dollar of promised benefit. Right, so those were the, Adam, I have a couple of questions. Should I take them now? Somebody's raising their hand, and it may be, maybe something that requires clarification on my part.
Why don't we hold questions? I just see Steve, and I have an idea of what Steve wants to discuss. Why don't you keep going through the legislation, and then we'll circle back.
Okay.
Hang in there, Steve.
Okay, so the big differences between the Democratic and Republican partition bills were how much money was going to come from the federal government and how much from stakeholders, participants, retirees, and employers. The other differences were the Republican bill would have made changes in the way these plans are run going forward. Okay, in January, there were two partition bills that have been introduced, and one actually has passed. Okay. And the differences, the Democratic bill, which was called EPRA, Emergency Pension Plan Relief Act, provided for no cuts, right, either for active employees or retirees. So it was paid for, EPRA would be paid for simply with government revenues. There were no really strong governance provisions, changes in the way these plans would be run in the future in EPRA. If you applied for relief, there were criteria that basically would cover AFM, where money would go into, PBGC would take over a lot of the liabilities of the AFM plan. PBGC would use its money to pay for that, and the plan would be responsible for the remaining benefits. And the idea is this would be enough to let the plan survive forever for active employees and the retirees. Senators Grassley and Alexander, again, had a variation on this. The variation imposed basically a 10% cut on plans that use this relief. If you were a retiree, when you're in pay status, you would pay 10% of your benefit to the PBGC under the Grassley-Alexander bill. In addition, other pension plans, those that were not in serious trouble, but were in some trouble, retirees would have paid a lower premium to PBGC, right? So this would have affected not only the most severely underfunded plans, but almost all multi-employer pension plan retirees would pay at least a modest premium to PBGC. In addition, there was a premium for employers. Employers would pay a premium, and unions, AFM itself, would have to pay a premium. And every multi-employer plan currently pays a premium to PBGC, comes from the plan, of $31 per participant per year. That figure for underfunded plans would have leaped to as high as $330 a participant. And I don't want to get into the details of that. It would not apply to all plans, but it would apply to a whole bunch of plans, right? And those premiums, remember, come out of plan assets, right? So a lot of these cost impositions that were placed on the union and the employer and on the plan would have affected active employees indirectly, right? Because most of those costs probably would have come out of the bargaining package, right? And in terms of the unions either will provide fewer services to its members or will have to raise dues, right? So, so a lot of these costs, even though they weren't directly imposed on active employees, would have come out of the pockets of active employees. In addition, the Grassley-Alexander bill had explicit limits on benefits that could be paid to active employees in the future if the plan got partition relief, right? So Grassley-Alexander, although it was a significant government contribution, most of the cost would have been paid by employees and retirees. Okay. Grassley-Alexander bill, the proponents of it and the proponents of the Democratic partition bill tried to negotiate, and they tried to come up with a compromise package, and ultimately it just didn't work. And then what happened is Georgia, right? Unexpectedly, the Democrats have controlled the Senate. And there's a process in, ordinarily most of you, probably every one of you know that a bill needs 60% of the senators to avoid a filibuster, right? And since the Democrats only have, 51 votes, counting the vice president, legislation that was, couldn't pass without Republican support. But there's this process called reconciliation. And the budget reconciliation process, it actually has kind of interesting historical roots, which I probably shouldn't waste time talking about right now. But in 1974, it was an attempt to get a chief executive like President Nixon to spend money that Congress appropriated, right? That's sort of the origins of this budget reconciliation process. And the way the reconciliation process works, and it only requires 51 votes, right? So there's no filibuster. The way it works is first there's a resolution from the budget committee, and the resolution is just numbers, right? It says for these categories of spending, here's what we want in each of these categories. And one of the categories is income security, right? And that includes pensions. Right, so there's a budget resolution with just numbers. And then the committees, the substantive committees, shape legislation to spend more money if they've been told to spend more money in this budget proposal, or to spend less money, right? And so this now goes to substantive committees, and they design the actual legislative language. The legislative language goes out of committee and goes back to the budget committee, and the budget committee assembles all of these individual pieces of legislation and puts it into one bill, and that's the budget reconciliation bill. And then it goes to the floor of the House and the Senate, and there can be lots of amendments, and in the Senate the process is known as a vote-a-rama, right? So there'll be lots and lots of amendments. The period for debate on the amendments is extremely limited. I think it's 1 minute on each side. And then there's a vote on each amendment. This process can take weeks, right? Which is why ultimately the projected date for the reconciliation legislation I'm about to describe is probably sometime around the middle of March. Okay. So you'll see, if this process goes forward, you'll see a lot of time in the Senate just spent on hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of votes, most of which will be rejected. Okay. Now, the thing about the budget reconciliation process is it's a budget thing. And there are rules, it's called the Byrd rules or Byrd Amendment, that allow any senator to say, hey, I don't think this fits under the reconciliation rules. And there are two things in particular that are important in the Byrd rule for pension legislation. One is the pension legislation, like if there's anything that doesn't primarily have budget impact, if it's only incidental, right? So policy things like governance reforms, that can't be in a reconciliation package because that doesn't impact the budget, right? And the other thing that's particularly important, there are some other things that may or may not be important to the pension legislation I'm about to describe. But the other thing is there can be no costs, net costs in a reconciliation package that go beyond the budget window, which typically will be 10 years. And in the current resolution, it's 10 years, right? So that means essentially we're looking at spending right now. For example, we can't increase the PBGC guarantee because that will take us outside the 10-year window, right? Oh, that was something else both Grassley-Alexander and the EPRA bill had in common. They would have both raised PBGC guarantees for multi-employer plans rather substantially. About 20,000 in Grassley-Alexander and about 24,000 in the Democratic House bill. But that can't be really done in reconciliation because with the money that's going into these plans, we probably won't have any plan failures in the next 10 years. And if the guarantees continue beyond that 10-year period, it would be a cost outside the budget window, which would have to be offset. And nobody wants to come up with offsets because those are things like permanent tax increases. Okay, so we had a budget proposal from both the Senate and the House. And the budget proposals have, I don't know, something like 1.3 or 1.4 trillion dollars, most of the COVID relief package in the income security category, right? So there's instructions to spend a lot of money on income security. And if you look at the House Ways and Means Committee website, right, and you go to something called COVID-19 reform, and you drop down, you'll see pension relief in two places. One is in sections, which will give you a description of what's being proposed. It's just like 3 or 4 paragraphs. And you can also go to the full text. So if you're really, into a masochism, you might want to go to the text. But otherwise, I think just reading the description in the sections will give you a pretty good idea of what's in this bill. Now, what's in this bill? It's not partition, right? Because partition has problems well beyond the 10-year budget window, right? It's very hard to work a partition mechanism into a reconciliation package, right? So what the bill does is it just gives money to plans that are in deep trouble, critical and declining status, and there are a couple of other types of plans that can get relief. All right, so this bill will give money to your plan. The money will be enough that with existing assets, the plan will be able to remain solvent for 30 years through 2051, right? And that takes care of a lot of the problem, obviously. The money that the plan gets, and I think this is something that is of interest probably to a lot of you, the money the plan gets from the government has to be invested in safe bonds, right? It can't be invested in crazy stuff. It can't even be invested in stocks. The plan's other assets, of course, can still be invested prudently by the trustees, right? And there'll be new contributions coming in. So the idea is the plan will be able to survive well beyond 2051 if it's prudently managed. There are some provisions in the bill, not many, but there are some provisions that seek to put some control on a plan that applies for this relief, right? So one thing that PBGC can do is put limits on benefit increases in the future. It can also put limits on employer contributions, saying they can't drop below current levels if it wants. And what I think is of most interest to some of you is that it also allows the PBGC to say to trustees, when you're investing, here are some parameters for investment. You can't make, if PBGC wants to do this, they can say you can't make more than maybe a very small portion of very risky investments. Now, we don't know, one, whether this will pass, and two, what PBGC will actually do with that, if anything. But there is a provision that would allow PBGC to put limits on the plan's investment practices, not with respect to the money that's going in, which has to be invested in safe bonds, but with other plan assets, right? So there'll be some check, or there's some potential check on investing in very risky assets. Okay, so so that bill is, it's now on the House Ways and Means website. There's going to be a markup, I think, on Wednesday, tomorrow. Markup means the committee will begin its process of considering amendments to the bill. I know that the people who have pieced this legislation together in Congress to try and get it within the reconciliation rules are hoping that Republicans, even if they won't support it, will ignore it, will not raise points of order under the Byrd rule, and will not make many amendments to it, if any. So this is legislation where you probably want to both thank the people who are supporting it and let those people who are not likely to support it know that this is very important to you, and you'll be following what happens, right? And so anyway, that's kind of my presentation. I guess it's 7 minutes longer than I thought I would go, but there was that full screen for a moment that confused me. So
no worries. I have no idea who that was. Maybe it was Treasury. So Norm, before we take questions, just because we have such a big group, and again, I want to express my appreciation to all the AFM members across the country who've attended today's Zoom meeting. A couple things, just because I don't know if people will take off at what point. I just want to give some information out. Two important questions: what are we doing through the union lens, and what can you guys do as members? At Local 802, if you go to the website, we've put up a Pension Action Center, and if you click on it, you're going to see everything from a petition you could participate in. The AFM is doing some great phone banking. There's a link to that. There's also a link to the MEPRA application itself if you want to read it. And also very important, if you want to comment on the MEPRA application, there is a time constraint. I believe it's open for another 27 days.
I think it's March 7th, right?
Until March 7th. So, that's at anyone's own discretion. All of those links are at on the Local 802 website in the Action Center. We will continue to discuss the legislation with our political contacts. I meet regularly with Senator Schumer's New York Chief of Staff and also his pension policy leadership, and we've had a relationship with them for a long time. They know that this is a top priority for musicians in New York and across the country. We'll continue to try and send out updates that we get. Obviously, as Norm laid out, there's going to be a fast process here, but a fairly confusing one through reconciliation. So we'll try and break that down as clearly as possible. To the question of what can you do as members, we need to act. I think there's the phone banking, the petitions. The commenting on the application, you know, look, if you feel like your leadership, whether it's at local 802 or the AFM or ICSOM or anywhere else, needs to do more, make sure that they're hearing your voice. And specifically what we really could do, and Norman brought this up, is the Ways and Means Committee, who will be looking at this in the near term, has Democrats and Republicans, and we universally have looked at this issue as apolitical. Everybody's affected no matter what party they belong to. If you are in a red state, and I know we have many friends on the call from across the country, we'll post on the local 802 website. There's about 20 members of the Ways and Means Committee that are in red states, and we are specifically going to try and target those House members so that they know that this is a priority for musicians across the United States. So I think all of those things we could work together to do. And to that end, why don't we open it up? We'll do some of the written questions, and then Steve, I'm gonna get to you. I see you have your hand up. If people want to go and ask a live question, we're going to do written questions that were pre-submitted at least for the next 15 minutes. But if you want to ask a question, if you go to the bottom of your screen, click on reactions and then click on raise hand, I will do my best to go in order of hands. The reality is we will not be able to answer every single question. But I promise, and Norm has been kind enough to help me with this, whatever questions we don't get to, please email me. We will try and put an F&Q on the website, but we'll also get back to you with some answers. So Norm, I am going to pull up the pre-submitted list of questions, which is pretty long. Let me find it on my very busy screen. And some of these Norman will answer, and some I'll try and help out. So the first question, are members over 80 years old exempt from the pension reductions?
Yes, under MEPRA they are. Under
MEPRA you are. Are there any other options besides cutting benefits to help the pension?
That's a very hard question to answer, right? It's really a question about what could have been done with this plan. And I don't think in the long run, one of the tragic things about the AFM plan now is it has two really lousy choices, right? One is to do MEPRA, and the other is to let the plan, continue for 20 years and be able to pay benefits for 20 years. And then maybe we, at that point we have a crisis. Oh, there's also something I want to say about the first, over 80 years old. That exemption is just in MEPRA, right? So if the plan becomes insolvent and you're over 80, but that's probably not going to happen for another 15, 20, or 25 years. If the plan becomes insolvent, the PBGC will still cut your benefit down to as whatever the guarantee level is.
So in terms of other things we've discussed in the past, we don't need to get into the details. Obviously, the things that help funds are increased employer contributions, good investment results, but unfortunately the time window for the AFM and the severity of the problem has perpetuated a real crisis. If you go to the Musicians for Pension Security website, there was a plan proposed there a few years back that would have created some level of solutions. Are Virginia representatives and senators supportive of the pension bailout in Congress?
I think the answer is the senators are, the Republicans, probably depends partly on party, but I want to mention that 30 Republicans in the House voted for the earlier version of EPRA, right? So in the House, this has been bipartisan.
Which is rare. Can you explain why our pension was not allowed to have a prudent reserve?
Okay, I think I know what this question is about. there was a time when tax rules said that if a plan had too much money, employers couldn't deduct their contributions, right, which were set by collective bargaining agreement. So what plans said we had to do was raise benefits, right, which meant that you couldn't get a reserve, because if you had a reserve, new contributions wouldn't be deductible. So we raised benefits and that eliminated the reserve. That's really not exactly true. The plan had choices, and the choice was to raise benefits or to kind of adjust the actuarial assumptions that they were using in deciding whether they were overfunded, right? So plans did have a choice. Some plans took what I think was probably a more responsible approach and changed actuarial assumptions, but not all plans did that.
Got it. And I think that relates to our 465 multiplier. Norman, I have one question on that. Do you have an idea of how many plans did make those changes?
No. And I've talked to some actuaries over the years, and I don't think it was many. That is, I don't think your plan was unusual. And there's sort of political dynamics, right? If it's if your choice is to raise benefits or to change funding assumptions, people like it when you raise benefits, and by the time the plan gets into trouble 15 years from now because you raise benefits, probably there'll be different union officers in place.
Got it. All right, next. Could we vote on what assets or markets the pension gets invested into? If not, what is it in now and who is managing it?
Okay, well, I really don't want to talk about what it's invested in now because I can't give a completely accurate answer. But no, that's something that the trustees have to, in their best judgment, decide. And in fact, if they let you vote, that probably would violate the statute, right? What you want is experts knowing what to do. And I won't say more about that than that.
Got it. And on the second part of that question, from my perspective as the 802 president, if not, what is it in now and who's managing it? I've found that since we moved to Cambridge, who is our outside chief operating investment officer, there's an increase in investments into an allocation that's opaque in private equity and hedge funds. And just as a steward of the union and for transparency's sake, after what's gone on, I would encourage our trustees to explain what some of those are and be clear with what our performance is. I've seen less information over the last year or two and not more, unfortunately. And I think after what they're, considering what they're asking of membership to go through with the cuts and what has happened, more transparency would help us all be accountable and move on. All right. Could we, as members of the AFM, vote down the proposed benefit reductions after it is improved by the government?
Yeah, there is, as I said, there's a voting process. It's, one way of characterizing this is a pretty rigged process, but yes, there is a voting mechanism.
So Norm went over that before. There's a voting mechanism. We would go through it, but the vote is rigged. The most hurtful part is anybody who doesn't vote, and this happens often with pension plans. The people who are affected are not always a majority of plan participants, but they're the people who've done a lot of work for many years. They're registered as votes for cuts. So not a real democratic system, that's for sure. All right. Does any reps or senators understand that the underlying problems with the multi-employer pension funds are a result of bad rules?
I think certainly if you speak to people who are knowledgeable in this area, there's a recognition of that. And One of the things that was, people who have been the beneficiaries of bad rules probably don't want to change them, right? So there are all sorts of political pressures, but I think there is, at some level, a very deep appreciation of the fact that the rules themselves are sort of broken. And, and the Grassley-Alexander bill, to its credit, addressed some of that, some of those problems. Not necessarily in the way that I think would have been the best way to address them, but, and the Democratic bill a little bit. As I said, if you apply for partition, PBGC now has the ability to impose some conditions on you.
Got it. Does Professor Stein think we really have options other than what the trustees are planning?
Yeah, I do, but I think they're legislative, right? I think there are, there's probably, without legislation, and one of the things that I think is unfortunate, and this is why the first application was rejected, is the trustee's solution wasn't going to save the plan. And that's basically why this was rejected. It would cut benefits, but in 20 years or 25 years, there was just too much risk the plan again would be out of money, right? So one of the things that I think is most unfortunate about this is the way it's, I think, unfortunately, pitted younger versus older workers against each other. I really think there should be a lot of commonality. I mean, you want the plan to survive and you want it to be able to pay all benefits. And by the time you're retirement age and you're expecting a benefit, right, you expect that benefit to be paid, and taking it away is really harmful. On the same hand, if you're a younger person and you're watching this and the rules aren't changed, even if you cut those benefits of those employees, you may be standing in their place 25 years from now or 20 years from now. So I really think this is an area where younger people and older people should see commonality of interest more than the kind of conflict that I think this MEPRA statute invited, which to me is one of the most unfortunate things about it. I think in the normal scheme of things, you want people in the same union to feel like they're all together in this.
Thanks, Norm. Yeah, I think this leads to a divide and conquer strategy that's used often, and hopefully we'll try and avoid that at the AFM. How do we do both? One, get a bailout, and two, change management of pension? I think you were clear on this one, Norm. The bailout would come through legislation, and
yeah, let's not call it a bailout. Because I think the government bears a lot of responsibility for what happened, because they're the ones with the bad rules in effect.
Yeah,
so let's call it a rescue rather than a bailout. That's
right. No using the B word. Change management of pension. That's an internal union issue, as everybody knows. Just per our bylaws, the international president is the co-chair of the pension fund when they're elected president at the AFM convention. And that international president appoints the trustees. The only, I believe the only restriction on that or rule is that there must be at least 2 rank and file members of the board of trustees. So all of that is controlled by the international AFM president, who's elected at a convention. How do we represent the lack of transparency to the government regarding the lack of real consideration for other investments? I think, Norm, you kind of went over this a little. I'll say this: if you have concerns about investment performance, lack of transparency, any issues with the fund, that would be appropriate to put in the comment section on the application. I think for our purposes with legislation, that's not going to be really applicable. Is class action legal procedure against trustees possible?
Well, you had one class action, right, which was settled. And you could have another class action, but it would be looking kind of at the time period after the first lawsuit. So it's probably premature, and it's also very, very difficult to win those lawsuits. You know, and we could spend 2 hours talking about why it's difficult to win those lawsuits. But the answer in theory is yes, but as a practical matter, that's not going to save this fund.
Got it. Here's another divide and conquer question. Is it not discriminatory to determine cuts based on age and/or when you started to collect under the established guidelines?
I think you're talking about under the age discrimination statute. No, I don't think so. At least it hasn't been raised seriously, right? It's you know, there are non-age related things, right? They say, well, it's not that we're cutting. If everybody here, this would be an example where I think you would have a problem, right? If the plan said we're going to cut everybody who's over 55, or everybody who's over 50, or everybody who's over 60, that would be age discrimination. But that's not what the plan is doing, right? The plan is saying, here are some benefits that just happens people only over a certain age had been entitled to, because ultimately we got rid of them for everybody else. So we're taking away those benefits. And you know, I don't think you can construct an age discrimination claim against that, even though I think it's a horrible thing to do. That I continue to think the people who are most affected by benefit cuts are the people closest to retirement or already in retirement.
Okay.
So no, technically it's not. You know, I don't think there's an age discrimination argument. Sympathetic, but it's not. I don't think it's legally actionable.
Understood. And again, these are all questions read as they were submitted. Is Millman to blame for any of the problems with our pension? They just took over handling another of my pensions, LA Phil Orchestra.
You know, I don't think this is the fault of any particular actuarial firm. I do think on the whole, the actuary profession has contributed to this, but most firms, you know, act more or less the same way. And within the actuarial community, that is among people who actually advise pension plans, there's been a lot of discussion about what actuaries should be doing. And, you know, if that debate is ever resolved, you know, actuarial firms may behave differently than they've behaved in the past. But I don't think it's, as much as I'm on the other side of that debate that most people at Milliman are probably on, I don't think it's I don't think it's Milliman being worse than other people. It's just Milliman's an actuarial firm, and this is what actuarial firms do.
Got it. I think we've answered this. Is there any way to avoid the 30% cut to our pension that the trustees are proposing? I think Norman went over the clearest route here is legislation and for us to be as active as possible. Is this act better than the Butch-Lewis Act, and how? Is there any measure for appropriations for the PBGC?
Okay, so actually this act technically is a Butch-Lewis Act. It's been named after Butch-Lewis just as the earlier ones have been. And the Republican bill, the Grass-Alexander bill, was named after this really great guy who was Grassley's chief of staff on pension issues, Chris Miller. So is this better or worse? Well, I think it's probably not as good as the earlier bill in some ways, but in terms of getting relief into the plans, this is great. It's going to transfer, I think there's $60 billion slated to get these plans out of trouble. And I think that's pretty remarkable. So I think this legislation, which has faults, and you can still push for pension reform generally if this goes through, right? This doesn't necessarily have to be the end of things, although it may unfortunately turn out to be that way. But if this goes through, it gets a lot of money into these plans that will buy these plans an incredible amount of time and protect most of the people who are on this phone call.
Okay. My wife and I are 75 and 76 respectively. We collect an AFM union pension. What are the prospects for our pension not being reduced?
Well, again, I think if the legislation passes, your pension will not be reduced. You're in that semi-protected age category, right? So your pension will not be reduced as much as other people's. And actually, this is something I can't get into now, because even if I did, I haven't studied it enough. But it'd be interesting to see how the application deals with the limited protections people under 80 but over 75 have, whether it applies to the maximum cut or everything but the maximum cut. And I think that might be a legal issue depending on what the application says. So if you have questions about that, you could write to Adam, and Adam could write to me, and that's something that I'll be looking at in the application.
Great. Over the past 30 years, I've watched the pension fund fail to recover from market correction when my own fund recovered. Why?
That's a question I think if you're ever at a cocktail party with your trustees, you might want to ask them.
Got it. Under what scenario is a pension benefit reduction of 33% considered fair and equitable?
My opinion is none. But yeah, I mean, I guess one situation is if the plan is going to have a bigger reduction because it's being taken over by the PBGC, but that's sort of never the case. These MEPRA cases come up where the people who are currently receiving benefits would do better without the MEPRA cuts.
Got it. Please address the conflicting data being disseminated by the AFM and MPS. Why don't I try and take this one? I believe the conflicting data is the trustees and MPS. Keep in mind, the AFM EPF is a separate entity to the AFM itself. The only way you could address the conflicting data is we clearly don't have an agreement on the facts. The one recommendation that I would make for people who want to get an independent review of the facts is there was a class action lawsuit that the outcome wasn't just a settlement, but also the release of a lot of deposition testimony from many of the key players who we've been trying to get information from for many years. I would say that I'm very comfortable if everybody goes to read those depositions and what's in there supporting any piece of information that has been published by MPS over the years. And you could find that, I believe, on the settlement website. I think some of the depositions have been taken down. If you want to see them, you could get in touch with me, but that is under oath. In it's not from us. That's a third party. It's coming from trustees themselves in the Southern District. Let's see. What is the best path to removing all trustees of the fund and replacing with responsible people who can we actually trust? Okay, this is just, we went over that. If people, I think everybody knows there's been a number of efforts to ask for better fund governance and different conditions for trustees being brought on. The co-chair, President Hare, has wide discretion with what he wants to do. I went over how trustees would be changed. Those are our bylaws. We abide by those bylaws as a union. If people want to see change through our union seems to be only done at a political level. It's somewhat democratic at the local, not somewhat, I should say, very democratic at the local level. At the national level, as you know, we have a convention. So whoever the delegates to the convention are, if that is a concern of yours, that is the place to bring that issue up and raise that issue. Why are the older pensioners being reduced at a higher rate than the younger pension contributors?
Well, I mean, I think there are two reasons for that, or two different types of reasons, right? What the trustees would say, and what they say in their application, is because the older employees or older participants were subject to more favorable benefit formulas. That's what they would say. I would say that there are other things going on as well. One of the things that's going on is unions are typically going to be more solicitous of younger members, right? A second thing that's going on is, I think it's to the, strategically, and this has been true in almost all MEPR applications, it's good to have a very large group of people who are not cut at all or cut just a tiny bit, because that means you'll get past the vote. And a third reason is really actuarial, right? The plan gets more bang for the buck cutting somebody who's in pay status, which is contributing to cash flow problems, than taking away a future liability, that's not going to come due for a long time. So, in one sense, that's where the money is. That's one of the things I think is unfair about MEPRA. But so I think a number of things are going on to explain that. But none of them are good if you're somebody who counted on your pension.
Got it. Norman, are you okay on time for another 20 minutes?
Yeah, I'm okay. I was on a call very early this morning, so I'm tired, but I'm probably just going to go in and after this is over and be yelled at my mother-in-law who lives with us for not cleaning the kitchen last night. So the longer I'm on this, the better.
Okay, glad to know we could help. Guys that are raising their hands, I thank you for being so patient. I promise I'm going to get to you. I just want to take the time to get through the submitted questions that people took the time to write. I promise we're close to the end of the list. Thank you for your time, Norman. Where are we? Well, we kind of touched on this. Why is the percent range of proposed cut so wide? My proposed cut is 30%. My wife's is 9%. That's unfair.
I think it's unfair too. Before MEPRA was passed, I gave some talks about why I thought it was bad. And one of the things I talked about was giving the trustees discretion on how to do the benefit cuts. And I said, if you're going to do it, just say it has to be across the board, right? Everybody gets the same cut. That's obviously not the approach that was taken. So I'm in agreement that this isn't fair. But I didn't write the legislation, and the people who did write the legislation didn't listen to me. And I don't mean to me, but to other people who were saying the same thing too.
Got it. Next question. Why have we not heard from the retiree rep after the latest reduction proposal? What has been his role?
I can't answer that. If you want to know what I think, there were some comments that were written for a group of retirees that I helped write, which does talk about some of the problems I think the retiree representative had in kind of defining what he was doing in the last application. Right? It's the same retiree representative. I think he means well, but I'm not sure he's, I don't want to say more than that.
Got it. I've stated this pretty clearly, and I know Brad Egan on a professional level and have a good relationship with him. But the level of conflicts Brad experiences as the retiree rep, sort of an endless list. Can I just ask a question, Norman? Because I think people are trying to understand it. There was sort of a public discussion from the retiree representative on the first application. Is there anything required of them for a second application? There's basically been little to no communication.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he is absolutely required to necessarily meet with people. I think most retiree representatives have done that, have tried to do that. you know,
Got it.
I wouldn't want to walk into a hostile wall of people, and I think that may be part of what.
Got ya. Okay. So they're like, clearly the rules don't prescribe more communication. All right.
I want to go back and check, so I'll double check, but I don't think there are any specific meeting requirements. He does have to write something at some point about, on the vote, for example, but.
Got it. All right. Let's see. Why no investigation into the relationship of our trustees with the investment firms that led to the terrible asset allocations? I'll just take this one pretty quickly. That's a question you have to ask the trustees. There's a little bit of discussion about their relationships in the depositions of the class action lawsuit. Again, you should read it. It's their own words under oath. You'll get your answers there. Will government assistance be predicated on a change of officers at the fund, as many of us have been advocating?
Well, except for what I mentioned, that there, on limitations on how the trustees invest, which might be part of the conditions for getting relief, the answer is no. In a MEPRA application, I think one of the things that you can say is the trustees have not shown a lot of acumen in their investments, and among the measures, reasonable measures they could have taken was to get better training for the trustees, and maybe some trustees who are experts, maybe change the way trustees are selected. Those are things that maybe are reasonable measures that could have been taken, that could be taken to avoid insolvency, that should be taken before they come to the government for relief.
Got it. Will the recent $18 million settlement bring the fund into solvency?
No.
Okay. What is the track record for the investments made by trustees? Let me just step in and take that one. You could either find it in, I think the AFM EPF still gives this out. It's on the MPS website. The best way to ascertain investment performance is to look at the trustees' own documents. There is a nice comparison they made of Taft-Hartley funds over a 10-year period, where we rank in the 99th percentile out of 100, 100 being the worst. Those documents will, read the trustees' own documents. That's how you could ascertain that, or the trustees can answer that question. What is the best way? Okay, we already went over that kind of a question. I'm a retired AFM Local 6 San Francisco. We received the proposed 2022 benefit estimate. Shows a 30% reduction for me, I'm 70, and only a 9% reduction for my wife. Why is the new multiplier cutoff set to 12/31/2009? Why is there not a flat percentage so all members share the cuts equally? This is grossly unfair. I think we've gone over this question a number of times, so I think everybody knows the answer at this point. Do you want to add anything, Norm?
No.
Okay.
Except the reason the multiplier was cut off, you can't, except until MEPRA, and even after MEPRA, without an application, you can't cut benefits once they've been earned, right? So when the trustees decided this benefit was too high for the plan to be able to continue paying, they cut it off, but they could only cut it off for the future.
Got it. All right. That was the end of pre-submitted questions. Thank you for hanging in, everybody. Let's get to the raised hands. Steve, you've had your hand up since you signed on. Let me unmute you. Are you good? There you go.
Hey everyone. I've looked through the list of people here. There's a lot of friendly faces, a lot of people I know. Many of you know me. I go by Thor right now. My professional name is an old nickname, Thor Sigurdsson, but I'm a cellist, and my idea is a very complex idea on one level. Certainly Adam has heard it before, and I'm grateful for him letting me speak just briefly about it. But the idea is to, and I know it's been brought up before by other people, but the idea is to have the union designate private music teachers to be eligible to become union members, and therefore being eligible to pay into our pension fund. And the reason I think this is the perfect opportunity is, I mean, when I first came up with this idea, or not came up with it, when I first got excited about the idea about 3.5 years ago, I certainly had no idea, nor could I have had any idea we would be in the situation we find ourselves right now, where probably most of the people here are actually full-time music teachers now. And yet none of us are able to contribute any of that money towards our pension fund. And that hurts both the pension fund, it also hurts us. So the idea is to figure out a way to meaningfully, in a meaningful way, extend benefits to private music teachers. I'm not talking about union members, I'm talking about non-union members. Extend to them a package of benefits, which would include a very healthy, hopefully healthy pension for the future, and include maybe health benefits. It could insurance of all kinds. But the point being that this is something that to me is almost a no-brainer. The hard part about it is it would require adjusting or amending the charter for the fund itself. And so obviously I'd really appreciate getting some feedback from the gentleman here today about whether they consider that to be a feasible thing to change the charter of the fund to enable a new designation. So obviously the other thing that the private teachers would bring to the table is they would pay union work dues on every lesson. So that would be, you pay union dues, you get to make a pension contribution on your own behalf. And it could be a group thing or it could be done individually. But it's very complicated. I'm not pretending it's not complicated, but I also think it's something that could make a sizable impact on the fund going forward. Because at this moment, I don't really see, there's fewer and fewer people joining the union for obvious reasons. More and more people are leaving the union for kind of obvious reasons. And I don't like that, because I'm a member of two locals. I'm a member of Chicago and Detroit, because I like Chicago. I like to work in Chicago. I live in the Ann Arbor, but so that's the end of my question, and I appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thanks, Thor. So before I let Norman answer the question about changing the trust legally, Thor, you have a pretty extensive document that lays out what, by the way, this is what I would consider at least a creative proposal. I don't know how, in application the possibilities yet, but Thor, would you want to share your email address for people who maybe want to see a copy of that? Did I lose him? Looks like maybe he signed off. All right, well, if he comes back, maybe
No,
he'll...
I didn't sign off.
Oh.
So no, I got muted. It's okay. The point is, I would love to be in touch with any and everyone about this. This is something that has to be addressed on a one-to-one basis with union members at the local level. I'm not expecting this to go all the way up to the head of the AFFM necessarily. I think it has to be taken place on a local level at first. And I know that that's what all the people I've shared this with over the years have given me the same answer. It's a local question, but it will impact the union pension fund. And that's, so yeah, please do, offer my information. You can find, I'm the only Thor Sigurdsson on Facebook. I'm the only Thor Sigurdsson on LinkedIn. So if you don't already know me, many of you do, but if you don't know me, go ahead and look me up on Facebook or LinkedIn. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Thor. Norm, from the amending the trust document, what's the ability for trustees to do that?
Well, I'm sure that could be done. I mean, the simplest way, of course, is just adding people as well, I don't know. I'd have to think about this. It seems to me that this is something that could be done. And of course, it's great to get new people, younger people and new people into both the fund and the union. So the challenge is, I think, probably more than a technical legal challenge about how to do this. It's how to light the fire under people so they want to be part of the AFM and they see benefits to them, tangible or intangible, of being part of the community of musicians.
Thanks, Norm. Next up, Richard Bucas. Hey, Richard. You gotta unmute. There you go.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Norman, for your expertise and your time. And one question I had, and I'm not sure whether this and Steve might be able to weigh in on this, is to what extent are we aware of sister unions in other trades that are multi-employer pension fund recipients or soon to be recipients, in terms of a national effort to pressure this advocacy? Has there been any kind of organized advocacy across all trades? And if so, how can we as members within our locals, be part of that advocacy? It might be a little too late because the bill is up for markup now, but it seems to me that there's probably lots of right-leaning members of plumbing unions and carpentry unions that are just in as much fiscal trouble with their funds as we are. And if we can demonstrate that this is a nonpartisan issue that affects all multi-employer pension fund participants, is anybody aware of any national effort to engage sister unions in advocacy for this?
Okay. There are a lot of different aspects of a response to that question. One thing I encourage everybody to do is look from time to time in the next week or so, next month, at the Pension Rights Center's website, because they've been working with a whole group, the number of different affected plans and participants in those plans. There have been a couple of attempts to create a nationwide organization that would transcend simply one plan. And I'm trying to think of I know there are a couple of, I don't know how successful those efforts have been. I think right now the getting people on the same kind of political, well, I shouldn't say political page, but getting on the same wavelength about what to do in the next month to increase the likelihood of passage of this bill is really important, which is one reason I encourage you not only to keep following the Facebook page and the Musicians Pension Security page, but also check the Pension Rights Center's website. There's also a group of unions that have been meeting really for the last 3 years. And part of their concern is something that is not directly relevant to you guys, something called the GROW Act, which is a different part of the multi-employer plan and a very controversial legislation that people think would undercut the multi-employer system, but other unions are very much in favor of it. This group are people who are opposed to this GROW Act, but they've also been pushing for multi-employer financial relief to troubled plans, even though some of the unions in that group have healthy plans, but some of them don't. And they're all pushing for this. So at the union level, there is this informal coalition. I wouldn't even say it's informal at this point, maybe 30, 25 or so unions that have been pushing for relief and opposing this GROW Act. But I think it'd be a great thing to have an effective nationwide organization, and maybe I could put you in touch with some of the people who've tried to do that, to put it together, because as I said, if this legislation passes, which we should all hope for, I think, I still think that there's need for additional legislation to kind of reform the way plans are governed, so they're not governed by basically amateur trustees. I think that's only going to come from participant groups, right? Unions and employers don't have, they kind of would, this is a great legislation for them. It's money without strings, very much strings attached. And I think if you want to reform the overall process to ensure that 25 years from now, when a lot of us on this call will no longer be around, won't happen to people who are now younger. Those reforms are really, I think, things that should be discussed very seriously. And it's only the participants in the plan who could push that kind of reform. It's because nobody else really has a strong enough interest in doing it or are antagonistic to the idea of doing it. So I think it's great, a great thing to be involved in.
And Richard, this is something we've been trying to work on at Local 802 and before with MPS. We have contacts with the Teamsters, Central States, people who've been working on this issue for years. It's always a little hard for unions to get out of their own way and realize we're all talking about the same thing, but we have a unique opportunity to do it now. So even on this Zoom, we reached out to a bunch of Teamsters locals. All the other entertainment unions, whether they were affected by this or not, are very much aware of the fact that it's a Local 802 and AFM issue, and they've been very supportive, even helping to get us meetings with the new Biden administration and others. So if people have good union contacts elsewhere, share that with us, and we'll try and reach out and keep everybody in the fold.
I think, although I'm not sure, NUCCP is one of the participant outreach groups or groups that's tried to recruit from lots of different plans. I'm not positive about that, but I think NUCCP. I don't know what it stands for.
Okay, next up, Frank. You got to unmute yourself.
Yes, sir, Adam. Can you hear me?
Roger.
Maestro Stein, Adam, can you hear me? Okay, great. Maestro Stein, it goes to the issue of governance. Is there any entity, is there any controlling body which regulates the activities of trustees? Is there any oversight exercised by anybody over these folks who are fiduciarily responsible? Where do we turn to when we suspect things are not right?
Okay, well, there are really two paths. One is the Department of Labor, and the other is the other is bringing a lawsuit, right? So in theory, right, it's possible to bring a lawsuit and get a trustee basically thrown off the board of trustees, but in real life, that's really hard to do through a lawsuit. The Department of Labor, it has an enforcement division, it has some resources, but this is not an area that, to police the internal workings of all of these pension plans is just really, really difficult. And in the single pension plan area, where you're just dealing with a pension plan sponsored by an individual employer, if the pension plan gets in trouble, PBGC has a lot of power over that pension plan because they could force it to terminate if it doesn't make some changes. But there's nothing really the equivalent of that, which PBGC has with respect to multi-employer pension plans. So yeah, the Department of Labor or going to court, and those are both really bad mechanisms to get governance change. Central States pension plan, which was controlled by elements of organized crime for a long time, signed an agreement with the Department of Labor, and they reformed some of their practices, but a lot of people weren't, felt that there were still problems even after that. So it's hard to get the Department of Labor to focus on these kinds of problems unless it's, theft. And, in your plan, as far as we know, we have people who are, working in good faith, at least, they think they are. They're not stealing from the plan, right? They're not being paid outrageous salaries. They're not getting kickbacks. And without those kinds of facts, it's going to be really hard to convince the Department of Labor that there's very much they can do. When you're just dealing with differences of opinion about whether the fund is being prudently managed, that's something the department doesn't really, unfortunately, get into. And And it may be even more unfortunate if it did get into, because I'm not sure you have, the degree, the depth of resources in the department to kind of do that kind of policing.
Great. Ken?
Hi, Adam. Thank you. First, special thanks and deep appreciation to Professor Stein for his time and expertise. And on a personal side note, having been a union member for half a century, that's embarrassing to admit, I've been to a number of administrations. I've been living abroad for a while, and when I'm able to get back to New York, I really want to meet you in person, Adam, because I've been following your articles in the print matter, and I love what you're doing for the local. You and Professor Stein touched on this, and maybe that's the best we can hope for at the moment, about the retiree rep. Tough job, I would imagine. It sounds, I'm going to dump this in your lap because it sounds like it's under your purview, Adam. It sounds like you know or knew this guy, and that you feel perhaps he's functioning in our best interest to the best of our ability. I only ask this because one of the areas in which we could question the efficacy of our functioning thus far in comments was about the function of the retiree representative. And of course, I don't want to cast aspersions where they are not due. I have to go back and recast a letter now a second time to Treasury and to all concerned. And I can go over certain things that I still feel were really mishandled, but I don't know much about what the retiree rep is doing or how you feel he's functioned thus far. I'd appreciate your input.
Thanks, Ken. And for the record, Ken and I have actually not met, and I did not pay him to say any of that. It's good to see somebody's figuring out the time change and tuning in overseas. Look, Brad Egan, who is the president of the local in Minneapolis, I believe, long time. Maybe I wasn't clear when I said this. I had the pleasure of meeting Brad at the convention. He is a very kind person, very smart guy. We disagree on policy at every single point. We don't agree about anything. His role as retiree representative was made complicated by his own choices. He nominated our current co-chair, trustee, and President Ray Hare at the convention we were at discussing pension policy. There's a way to do this to try and show some public accountability, change, deconflicting, any of that. And there just seems to not be a lot of tolerance for moving in that direction from at least leadership. That being said, from the beginning, Brad seemed very conflicted, and I think a lot of people were disappointed with the way he managed his role for the first application and the comments that he produced. And I think the issue I actually was bringing up is I haven't heard anything from him since the second application was filed. So that to me seems like a communication issue too. But it's hard to answer for somebody else, and I don't want to cash any personal dispersions because I've met him and he's actually a really great guy. But the role is just conflicted and complicated from the start. So let's see, next question, T. Cook.
Yes. Can you hear me?
We can.
Professor Stein indicated earlier that it might be a good idea to temporarily withdraw the application for reduction of benefits. And my question is, why is that a good idea? And is there anything we as participants can do to influence that?
Okay, so one reason I think it's a good idea is, or maybe the primary reason is, right now that application is creating both a distraction from the legislation and a lot of anxiety that may be unnecessary if the legislation is enacted. People have till March 7th to file comments. If the last application is any reflection, we're probably going to have more than half the comments filed in the last week, which means people are going to be putting a lot of effort into this application before they know whether this legislation, which would make the application unnecessary, passes. But I think if the trustees were able to withdraw the application temporarily, or I don't know what they could work out with the Department of Treasury, but there is a procedure to withdraw the application and then be able to resubmit. I think that would allow people to devote more attention to the legislation. And by the way, your trustees, I think, are, probably very strongly in favor of this legislation. I was just on a call with Democratic staffers, and one of your trustees was, it was a large call, but one of your trustees was on that call. And I think, this is one area where the trustees and everybody else, I think, are in sync that this legislation is really important. And the way to get people to focus on the legislation rather than filing their comments would be to withdraw the application. Now, the downside from the trustee standpoint, just trying to put myself in their heads, is if the legislation doesn't pass, right, and it's not a sure thing, they'll have lost time. And losing time, when you're talking about stemming cash flow problems is important. But on balance, I think they probably, if I were in their position, I would withdraw the application. And I think it's probably something that would be popular with most members, right, if they withdrew the application. So they get, I think there are a lot of reasons for them to do it. There are some reasons for them to not do it. Putting pressure on them, writing them and saying, withdraw the application so we can all work together in getting this legislation passed. Maybe that would help. I don't know, but I'm not sure what else you can do other than that kind of, effort at persuading them.
So just,
and they may be thinking about this now, for all we know.
Hopefully they're thinking about it.
Yeah.
Norman, and to be very clear, the AFM is supportive of this legislation. They've set up phone banking. They're doing the right things here. We've asked them to work together. Haven't heard from them on that front, but the reality is it's great that they're supporting it. I'll just speak for local 802, and I think this should work for most locals. It's a democratic system. What my members tell me is what their concerns are. I represent those to AFM leadership or the trustees. That's simply what we're elected to do. If and I'm supportive of them withdrawing the application. If I get the sense from membership, and that's clearly communicated, and I would advocate for everybody, if that's your position, to contact your local leadership. That's what we're going to communicate to the AFM and the trustees. Next question, Heather.
Thank you so much. My question is for Mr. Lewis. Can you clarify the Byrd rules, the Byrd amendment? I think you said that the pension legislation, if there is anything that doesn't have a policy impact, it can't go in the legislation because it doesn't impact the budget. And the second thing was that if there are costs in the package that go beyond the budget window, being typically 10 years, those can't be included. Can you clarify those for me and make sure I got it?
So actually the Byrd amendment, a point of order under the Byrd amendment, I think there are 6 grounds for it, some of which are clearly not relevant. And the 2 that I think are most relevant are the 2 that you just mentioned. It's not that something can't have a policy impact. It's that the policy impact, it has to be more than incidental to the funding thing, right? So you can't have a provision that doesn't have much to do with the budget, doesn't have much of a budget impact, but does affect policy. So for example, I mentioned this thing called the GROW Act, which is a provision that's supported by some unions and opposed by others. And what it would do is create a new kind of plan that's part defined benefit plan like your plan, and part kind of more like a 401k plan. It's complicated, but that's a very rough description. That will have a policy impact that overwhelms the budgetary impact of the proposal. So that's, even though that's supported by Democratic leadership and in fact by most Republicans who are involved in this, although in some cases reluctantly, it's not in the reconciliation bill. It was in EPRA. It was part of the Democratic bill that passed, it's been passed a couple of times now. But it has a policy impact without really impacting the budget. So if something has a policy impact, but it's really has an impact on the budget, that's okay. So for example, one of the things, minimum wage, not to get into minimum wage in this phone call very much, but minimum wage, even though it will have modest impacts on budget, for example, people who are paid minimum wage will pay more tax, right? So that's positive for the budget. But it also has some downsides to the budget, right? Some people may lose their jobs, employers will have fewer deductions. So you can say this will have some impact on the budget, but it's primarily a policy thing with only incidental budget implications. So that would not be okay in the Byrd Act. If a point of order is raised, I shouldn't say it's not okay, it's probably not okay. It's very susceptible to a point of order in the parliamentarian ruling that it conflicts with the Byrd Act. The outside the budget window simply means looking forward 10 years. The budget window is a 10-year window in this bill. Looking beyond the 10 years, anything that's going to lower revenue outside the 10-year window has to be offset by something that will increase revenue. And that's very hard to shape in reconciliation, right? So to get into the, a couple of the technical details of the bill, this will have some impact outside the 10-year budget window. And the way they try and deal with that is by raising some additional revenue, one by raising slightly the PBGC premium 10 years from now, right? And that raise in the premium is expected to partly cover the costs that would take place outside the 10-year window. So I don't know if that's, if that helps. It's really complicated. And when I first got into this several years ago, I was trying to figure out how budget reconciliation worked. Somebody told me there were only 3 people who ever really understood it, who are Senate staffers, and 2 of them now are dead. It's very complicated. And the people who are drafting this bill are doing everything they can to make it go through, but they're not positive that that there may not be objections.
Thanks, Norm. Next is Diva.
Hey, thank you so much, Professor Stein and Adam. This has been excellent. There's been so many informative things here. I'll make this quick. I missed the very beginning of the webinar, but what I'd like to know is, Professor Stein, are you going to be actively involved in consulting or advocating for us during this legislative process? And I'm dismayed to hear that the 2 of the 3 staffers are dead now. Sounds like you
no, this is that's sort of a joke, right?
So it would be great if you were there helping out. I don't know if that's possible.
No, I've the Pension Rights Center, the organization that I do some outside work for, other than my teaching, is very involved and has been very involved really now since 2010, since the first, since Senator Case. You weren't on the beginning of the talk, but there had been legislation as early as 2010 to try and help struggling multi-employer plans, and we were very active in opposing enactment of MEPRA, and then we've been working ever since on getting good legislation to replace MEPRA. In fact, we had the first legislation, which came from Bernie Sanders' office and Marcy Kapper. We had a very substantial hand in drafting, and we've been very involved with everything that's been happening in the last month. So yeah, I'm involved, and Adam is involved. you know, there are lots of people who are pushing this.
Yep. Diva, Norm has been talking about musicians on the Hill and making sure that we're heard for years now. We're lucky to have him. All right, it looks like we have 5 more questions, and we could get to the end of all questions, which would be great. I appreciate everybody's patience, especially with such a complicated subject. Next up, Bernard.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Norman and Adam, for this webinar. I have a question. I like to hope for the best and plan for the worst. So this is a question about comments on the plan. Are there any specific things that we can mention in our comments or points that would help us to possibly do the same thing that we did? I'm not sure whether we had that much of an effect last year, but to at least try to influence Treasury, to at least kick this plan out. And I had asked the question about Brad because I noticed that he's been completely absent this time around, and I didn't even know that they had reappointed him or if they have to reappoint somebody because it's a second application, or whether or not his position just stands. And there's one other question. There was and this has nothing to do with that, but there was a miners union, similar, I think also multi-employer union that was bailed out. That was in, I think, Kansas, right? Obviously Mitch McConnell helped with that one. But I was wondering if any of the points that were used to help to bail out that plan are going to be used for us or in this new legislation.
Are you talking about the United Mine Workers plan?
I believe so. I think.
Yeah, that's what Mitch McConnell.
Right.
So I don't know how much time it's worth spending on this, but there were 2 big, from the government standpoint, a lot of this problem in terms of how much it's going to cost, how much it would cost the government to fix, comes from 2 plans. One was Central States Pension Fund, which is another fund we've been very involved with at the Pension Rights Center, and they beat their application, which was not refiled. And the other was United Mine Workers Health and Retirement Funds, which wasn't even eligible for MEPRA because their benefits were so low that you couldn't cut them below 110% of PBGC guarantee levels. So a relief bill was needed to save both of these plans. There was separate money that was sort of available in something called an abandoned mine fund, which had been set up to fix mines that were environmental hazards. And there was money in that fund. And I can't remember what that money was earmarked for, but it was possible to redirect that money into the Mine Workers Fund, which made it okay. And there were people, and I was among them, that said, don't let Mitch McConnell do this because he's doing this because he has a lot of coal miners in Kentucky who he's concerned will not vote for him if he doesn't do this. Make him put this in the package that applies to all plans. But he was able to go ahead and he made some tip, he gave a tip of his hat to, of course, I'll support broader pension legislation at some point in the future, but all he's done is block it. So I don't think that's really something that's going to be helpful for us in this effort. I'm not sure about that. It may be possible to say, hey, you promised when you did this, or you sort of promised that this was just the first step. But so in terms of your other question about what to put in the MEPR application, I think one thing is optics, right? So telling your own stories is really important. But Treasury, in order to reject the application, also needs you to do, if you can, you don't need to do this, right? But to focus on some of the things that the application has to show, right? And some of that, as I said, is technical, like the assumptions being used are incorrect. And some of those assumptions, though, you could look and say, hey, they're assuming there are going to be lots of new entries into this plan, and that's just not true. Or if the music industry is going to recover to this extent, and that's not true. Right. But the other things you can talk about, of course, are the benefit cuts, whether they're equitable or not, whether the retiree representative is doing what he's supposed to do, or whether he's just representing the plan rather than the retirees and deferred vesteds. And also the stuff about reasonable measures that should have been taken or could have been taken. Those are things that are bases for overturning the application. And I think, although I can't imagine Treasury would ever do this, I think even the difficulty of reading communications from the fund and how they're not really written to, with the average participant in mind, so the average participant can figure out what's going on and calculate how they're going to be affected. That's also a criterion for the application to be approved. So that's something else you can talk about. In the last letter, when Treasury turned down the first application, it mentioned those two assumptions that I mentioned earlier, right? One of the assumptions was mortality, how long we can expect musicians to live. And they said the fund was having you die off before you actually are likely to die off. And the other was, what about new people coming into the fund, reviving the fund? And Treasury said, no, that your assumptions on that were too optimistic also. But Treasury also said, we're not commenting on all the other things that were raised in the comments, which suggests that maybe some of those things would have been alternative grounds, right? And, and there's been a change of administration also. So there may be, more interest in some of the other areas than perhaps there was in the previous administration. That's difficult to say, right? A lot of this is driven by what our former president called the deep state, staff people, but some of it is obviously driven by people who are political appointees, and there may have been some difference in perspective. Certainly under the previous administration, a lot more applications were approved than under the Obama administration. The Obama administration turned down a number of the early applications. Most of the applications that were submitted over the last 4 years were approved. Not all of them, but most of them. Yours being one of the big examples of one that wasn't. And I think a lot of that came from all the comments that were submitted.
So just to recap, because this is important if this is something that people are thinking about, issues listed were for commenting on the application. Do you believe the cuts were done equitably or not? Do you believe the retiree representative is representing you in the way that the statute lays out? Do you believe that the industry assumption, this is something that I take issue with, is correct for our industry? There's obviously, we know better than anybody else what our industry looks like. And have they taken all reasonable measures? Those are the categories we should be looking at. Norman, this is a related question that came in from Robbie. What is a revised estimate of time until insolvency? It was said to be 20 years, but that was over a year and a half ago before the pandemic put an enormous dent in contributions coming into the fund.
Yeah, I haven't really gone through the application with enough, in enough depth to say. I've skimmed it. There are some people who have been really looking at the application very closely, and some of them are advised by a friend of mine, Terry Deneen, who was a very high-ranking career person at PBGC. And he's terrific, and he's been really combing through the application, exploring what kinds of things, or trying to identify what kinds of claims that the trustees are making are perhaps questionable. But you guys are probably, some of you are in a really good position to look at that application and see things that the eyes of outsiders like Terry and me are not as likely to pick up.
Robbie, there's a group of musicians in Nashville, the Musicians for Pension Security contingent there, that Steve Nathan, who I think is on this call, has done incredible work. All those guys have been sort of digging into the next application. If anybody wants to get a better idea of what's in there, and Terry has been helping them out, brilliant guy, just contact me and I'll put you in touch with that group, because I think that's an unanswered question that's very important right now. Okay, next up, we're getting there. Gregory.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for holding this webinar, and thank everyone for their very astute questions. My question might pale in comparison. In April of 2013 here in Chicago, there was a presentation by pension fund officers and at least one trustee, where it was stated that the multiplier cannot be lower than $1, that it can never be reduced lower than $1. And I asked if that was true, and the question was scuttled. And I would like your opinion if that multiplier can be reduced lower than $1 or not.
Yeah, I mean, legally it can be reduced below $1. My understanding what the trustees were saying is this is sort of the basic benefit in the plan, and we're not willing to reduce it by more than that. So, you can argue with that or not. I mean, frankly, I think $1 multiplier is a decent enough benefit. It's not a great benefit, but it's decent enough, and it's typical of a lot of plans. In fact, under the Grassley-Alexander bill, it was the maximum benefit that would be permitted if a plan applied for partition, that you couldn't have benefit accruals in the future above that level. And if your plan had a different kind of formula, it had to be converted to the equivalent of a 1% of contribution. And 1% of contribution, without getting into this with too much math, is a very generous benefit for older workers. For younger workers, the early accruals really aren't that valuable, right? Because you have so many years to earn basically the money you need to pay the benefit before you retire. But I think there's no reason why a plan couldn't provide lower benefits. A lot of plans do provide lower benefits. That's really a question of, what the plan has money for and what its members, expect. And but legally, if they were saying legally they couldn't do it, that's not true.
Thank you.
Thanks. Last two questions, Michael.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you. This might be applicable for maybe Norman or Adam. So 6 years ago, when this all happened, I called up the pension department and they sent me a complete list of all the assets that we have: bonds, stocks, preferred dividends, everything. So when I looked through it, it looked like they were churning the fund. I mean, I see sales on here of like 1 share. I see stocks that were bought 3 times the same stock, obviously buying and selling. Well, my question is, this is 6 years old, who knows what's in the fund anymore, but can they be sued for churning?
I think if they were going to be sued for churning, well, without having the settlement agreement of that class action lawsuit, that were brought by, Paul Levant and anyway, without looking at the settlement, I can't say for 100% certainty, but I would be willing to wager a very large bet that that stuff is what they did 6 years ago is not something which could be challenged now. There's also a statute of limitations problem, right, for what they did 6 years ago. So I would say you'd have to, if you were actually thinking about bringing a lawsuit, you'd have to be focused on what they're doing now rather than what they did 6 years ago. And keep in mind too, you bring a lawsuit, one of the problems with that kind of lawsuit is, the trustees, even if you got $1 billion judgment or a $500 million judgment, which, that's something that might really help the fund. There's no way that the trustees could, even if you were able to win a lawsuit like that, the trustees would be basically judgment proof. The money would never really get into the fund, right? Essentially what this lawsuit did was it looked to the insurance policies, and that's the way things usually would happen with these kinds of lawsuits.
Last question, you hit it.
Yes, hi. Can you hear me now?
We can.
Good. Okay. Well, I have two questions. One, I want to be sure to get the details about the legislation that, and I want to be sure which websites to go to so I can find out exactly what to write to my representatives. Was that on the local 802 website? Is that what you were?
That is, just go to local802.com and click on the Pension Action Center. And we're gonna, at the end of this, we'll eventually post this whole meeting, and we're also gonna post trustee contact information. If it's people's position that the application should be temporarily withdrawn, you can contact them that way. We'll also put links, as I said, to the application itself and the comment section, and whatever else we need to get up there moving forward.
There's bills.
One way you could find this very quickly, if you don't want to wait till it's posted, is you can either go to the waysandmeans.house.gov website and kind of click where it says COVID-19, I think it's responses or something, or you can just type in Butch Lewis Emergency Pension Plan Relief Act. Probably all you need to do is punch in Butch Lewis Emergency Pension, and the description should pop right up from that website.
Right.
Okay.
Okay, so that's the waysandmeans.house.gov.
Waysandmeans.house.gov. All right,
Okay.
and then go toward kind of the bottom of the screen, and
Cool.
COVID-19, I think it says responses, but something like that.
Okay.
It should be obvious. Don't push the top of the screen, which says COVID-19 resources. You want to go to the bottom of the screen that says COVID.
Okay, thank you. Now, the second question is this. It sounds as though the AFM president has a huge amount of power in determining the makeup of the trustees. Is that true? What I'm hearing about that?
Well, these trustees are divided between in this kind of plan, they're divided between management trustees and union trustees. And the AFM, the president has, I think he appoints the trustees. I think it's just up to him. And as outrageous as that might sound to you, it's not all that uncommon for union leadership to have this kind of power, right? And but it's not good. It's not good. These plans should be run, in my view, should be run by people who know how to run plans, not people who are kind of motivated by, what they really know is union politics. It doesn't seem to me that that's the primary qualification for a well-run trust.
Excuse me. So thank you. And follow up. So it sounds as though if we wanted to make a change, we would need to either, try to get a different president in it, or try to, or somehow change the bylaws.
Yeah, I think you'd have to change the bylaws or get a new president. Musicians for Pension Security had a suggestion for what kind of qualifications trustees should have, which I think it presented as a proposal, and it was not accepted by union leadership. But it was really great. I thought the very, very thoughtful proposal.
Okay, so hopefully we will keep trying on that front, but as a long term.
Yeah, I think it's long term.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
Yeah, so we're gonna wrap up. Like I said, if there's other questions, just send them my way. Norman and I'll do our best to answer them. If you told me 4 or 5 years ago, we'd have a few hundred musicians on a Zoom in 2021 talking pension policy, I would have said, yes, that's right. If there's issues with the plan, because musicians don't mess around with things that are important, and they're smart and tough. I want to thank everybody. I know times are tough for musicians regardless. This does not make it any easier, but showing up, understanding what's going on is the key to us acting together here. I want to express my deep appreciation for Norman coming and sharing his expertise and knowledge, and we'll continue to give you guys whatever we have.
Yeah, I also want to say that the
you.
stuff Adam said about me at the beginning, that was just public relations fluff from my law school's public relations office.
Thank you, Norman. Have a good night, everybody. We'll be in touch. Good to see everybody too.